Hi folks, I've been having an interesting discussion with one of my viewers, Ken Brace, about the nature of consciousness. Ken seems to be taking the position that because we each have a separate experience of consciousness from each other, then there must be an absolute ontological separateness of self, if that makes any sense. In other words, we can't say I'm you, you're me, we are each other, because there is always the experience of being separate. So the separateness is fundamental. This is the way Ken thinks. I do not think like that at all. We've been having a bit of a back and forth in the comments, and I'm trying to get him to think of this in a different way, to model consciousness in a different way. I won't recount the whole conversation, but he brought up an interesting point here in his last comment that I think we'll talk about, and let's see where it goes. Ken says, let's say that a clone of yourself was created. Both yous would think yourself to be the original you. Since all the memories are intact, then you wouldn't be able to tell the difference. You'd have to look at the medical records to see which one existed before the other. The ego isn't attached to the experience. This is an assumption that you seem to be making, at least from what I can tell. You don't see the ego and the conscious experience to be separate. A clone would have a separate experience, but would have the same ego. Right, there's a number of things here that I think we need to talk about. Let me see if I can get the camera and the comment on the screen at the same time. Yeah, here we go. Okay. The statement, the ego isn't attached to the experience, well, it is. Because an ego isn't a thing. An ego is a word we are using to denote the experience of individual self-consciousness. That's essentially what the ego means. It's the experience of individual self-consciousness. So how can you separate ego from experience? Ken, you seem to be thinking of the ego as a thing that sits inside the brain. That is not necessarily true. In fact, if we bring in some science into this, if we think even of the likes of quantum field theory, it's certainly not true at all. Everything has to come back to the field. You can't have the self and the field as two separate things. Reality is a field. So you're the field. And I know I'm not expecting to sell that point very effectively, just with that little anecdote. But you see, if I take your original statement here, let's say a clone of myself was made. So the clone begins its life as an exact duplicate of me. Every cell in its body and everything in its mind is exactly the same as the original. So I would say it is the original. From that point on, it's like there was an episode of Farscape, the old sci-fi show, where the main character, John Crichton, got doubled. He got cloned, but you could never tell which was the original and which was the clone, because it wasn't done that way. It was done as doubling. It literally split him in half and created two fully formed John Crichtons. So one of these John Crichtons went off and had an experience with John Crichton's girlfriend, Erin Soon, and she just assumed she was with the right one because she recognized him, and they ended up making love and everything, and that John Crichton ended up getting killed. So Aaron soon comes back to their main spaceship where the other John Crichton is waiting, and she can't quite bring herself to accept this guy as the real John Crichton, because she now sees him as a separate personality and she experienced the death of the other. But they're really, he is just as much the original as the other guy, because he was doubled. And in your scenario, if you were saying the clone was created and it's an exact duplicate, then it really is the same entity. But as soon as those two people who look the same, as soon as they start to go off on their own individual experiences, they will start to become two separate people. Yes, they will have shared memories of everything that occurred before the cloning, but they would start to become their own individuals from that point forward. So, are you really trying to say that the only authentic version of that person is the original, and that the other one is somehow inauthentic? Why? Because you believe that there is somehow a soul or an ego attached in here to the original that isn't there? So are you saying that there has to be a different ego in the clone than is in the original? But if you really just look at what's going on, nothing is different. It only starts to become different when the two individuals start going off and having different experiences. So there are two egos in the sense that there are two individual experiences of self-consciousness. That doesn't mean there are two selves sitting inside heads, in two different heads. I feel that I'm not succeeding in communicating this very well, but it's just that we grow up with language being used in a certain way, particularly nouns. A noun is a person, place, or thing. So we assume that everything that is a noun is an actual thing, but it isn't, and there are numerous examples of how nouns are not necessarily things. For instance, take a shadow. I can create a shadow by taking my lamp over there and holding something in front of it. Hold on. There we go. I just made a shadow. There's a little bit of light coming onto my face, and there's my face in shadow again. So, is the shadow a thing? No. It's just an area where less light hits instead of more light. And it's an amorphous changing thing. I don't want to use the word thing, but you know what I mean? It's just an area where there is less light. It's not a thing in itself. Shadow is just a word we denote as a convenience to describe something that we see. It doesn't make it an entity. In just the same way, there is no entity called the self or the ego or the soul. We just have experiences of consciousness. And the problem is we were using words, and I'm using words like we, I, you. These words force us to think of the self in a certain way that isn't accurate. All I can really say is consciousness emerges here. Consciousness emerges there out of you. Consciousness emerges here, there, and everywhere, and we're all having experiences of consciousness. When I die, I have no sense that there is a self inside my head that either ceases to exist or goes off somewhere to have other experiences. The sense that I have about it is that The aperture through which consciousness flows closes. Consciousness will no longer flow through this body-mind. That's all death is, the closing of an aperture or the breaking of a lens. The thing that is authentically the self is the field. The unified field, if you want to call it that. You know, it looks like there is an absolute ontological separateness between this pencil and this pen. I can't make them, you know, fold into themselves, and I can't turn them into some kind of oneness. But I know that these pens are not really separate in the quantum field. They just appear separate to a creature, because that is how creatures operate. If you could, you know, somehow see reality from outside of your skull, it would just be a big, massive, confusing field of fuzzy waves that are all entangled. And the best analogy to that, of course, is the Matrix, where the idea is that the reality in front of your face isn't real. It's just kind of like a big computer program. And that's a suitable analogy. But an experience of consciousness like that, you know, outside of your body, if that were possible, it would be completely confusing, because consciousness requires an experience of subject and object. Because you have to say that you are conscious, you have to say what you are conscious of. So there's always going to be the feeling that there is the self and the other than self. But that's just the manner in which it functions. It doesn't mean there is an absolute separateness between self and other. There can't be, really. It's all just the field. My own personal favorite analogy to things like this here, you know, if you think these are ontologically separate from each other, think about two objects in a video game. You know, you might be able to push some blocks around in a video game, and you can bang them into each other and throw them off a ledge or do whatever. But those objects that you are moving, in a very real sense, you are moving them, albeit on a screen. They're following artificial laws of physics on your screen. They are not ontologically separate. They really just exist as ones and zeros flowing through logic circuits inside a computer. It's just this river of ones and zeros that's flowing. So it's a oneness in that sense. It's this river field, if you like. It's not a perfect analogy, but it's a pretty good one. It allows you to think outside of the box of what your eyes are telling you and what your hand is telling you when you tap a desk, or when you gaze at another person thinking that's a separate person, a separate self from me, because you can't reach in and grab that person's memories and make them your own. That doesn't mean they're a separate person. You're fixated on the idea that the person exists inside the head because you have a limited window of consciousness in the particular creature out of which you peer. You have to lose your sense of self as a personality with a bunch of memories, because that's not even a self. As I've said in other videos, your memories are always leaking as you move through life and forget old things and make new experiences. So memory is a kind of amorphous thing, like a shadow. It's always moving and changing. Personality changes as you go through life. It's just like a shadow as well, always changing. So what is this thing you call you? It cannot be located and identified, because consciousness is always moving and changing. There is no actual self that's identifiable as a thing, as an entity. That's why it makes much more sense just to model consciousness as a lens, as an aperture. the truest statement about consciousness, about the self, is I am the universe. It of course sounds bonkers to someone who hasn't thought deeply about it. It sounds like you're claiming some kind of godhood. And that is the truth. It is a kind of godhood. But of course, the common person understands that God is a cosmic personality. So it's like I'm not trying to equate myself to some kind of cosmic personality that rules the universe from some kind of big throne. That's nuts. There is no cosmic personality like that. There's no philosophical need for such an idea. It's just yesterday's bad idea. So also it has to be borne in mind that if I say I am God, if I say it that way, I also mean that you are God. So the whole thing's equalized anyway. You know? It sounds like a huge ego trip, but it's the complete opposite. It's saying that the ego is not real. When I say I, universe, it's not a statement that I'm bigger than I really am. It's a statement of complete non-separation. I and the universe are one process, one essence that can't be separated meaningfully. So I don't know, Ken, if any of this hits home or makes any sense. It is a very difficult transition to make, the transition between thinking of yourself as a separate self and coming to the awareness that there is no separate self, there's just the whole thing, and you're the whole thing. You're the whole thing experiencing separateness. You're not a separate entity in the whole thing. Can you tell the difference between those two statements? Yeah. Cartesian dualism, which is what is taught in Christianity and other religions, and it's also what we all unconsciously inherited, whether we are a Christian or an atheist or whatever. We all inherit these sort of ideas. Even Richard Dawkins, I remember Richard Dawkins saying something like, I feel very lucky to have won the genetic lottery, to be here as a person in this time, capable of doing these things. He said something to that effect in an interview. But there is no self to feel lucky. There's no I in here that got lucky. It's just life emerged this way, and this is the life that is here right now, doing this talking at this particular time. I never got lucky to be a human being. There's no I that got lucky. I don't know how to make this more plain. It's an idea that is as real to me as the table in front of me, but it is the hardest thing to express in language because of the way we use language, and it's what's loosely called non-duality. Anyway, just some thoughts. We'll see where this goes.